In this class, we study the philosophical background of cognitive psychology, namely, what the fundamental questions regarding the mind are and how can we study it. First, the thinking of cognition can date back all the way to the ancient Greeks. Almost all ancient Greek thinkers have proposed something about the mind or mental activities. For example, Plato's idealism posits that true knowledge and understanding lie in the realm of ideas rather than material objects. And Aristotle reads the five senses, which are seeing, hearing, smelling, touching, and tasting. In the East, the study of cognitive processes has been continuing for hundreds of years. In the 6th century, Chinese scholar Liu Xie made students draw a square with the left hand and a circle with the right hand as a test of their aptitude. This is the oldest documented psychological test. The Arabic scholar Alhazen wrote the Book of Optics. Among others, he explained the principles of pinhole camera and supported that the eyes don't emit light, which was in contrast with Plato, Euclid, Galen, and Ptolemy. So why do we study the historical and philosophical background of cognitive psychology? The current work usually addresses questions that have been raised and explored. The techniques evolve, the methods change, the answers are constantly revised, but the questions remain. Then what are the fundamental questions of psychology? There are two types of questions at large: the ontological questions and the epistemology questions. Ontology means the study of existence. Where does truth exist? Epistemology refers to the study of knowledge. How do we get to know the truth? An important ontological question is that how are the mind and the body related? Specifically, is there a mind to begin with? If so, what is the mind and where is it? How are the mind and the body related? There are some thinkers who believe that truth exists objectively. Everything should be explained in terms of matters. They are the materialists. Opposite to this are the idealists, who explain everything in terms of ideas. Truth exists subjectively, and truth exists because we are aware of it. Relatedly, there is a famous question: does a falling tree make a noise if nobody is around to hear it? How would materialists or idealists answer this question? For those who believe that truth only exists in one form, whether mental or material, they are monists. It is more likely that one may think the mind and the body both exist, and mental events and physical reality are both relevant. This is called dualism, and a famous dualist is René Descartes. To dualists, the key question is how the mind and the body are related. There are several ways the mind and the body are related. We only mention three here. First, interactionism, which says that the mind and the body interact. The mind initiates bodily responses. Bodily responses shape mental experiences. Look at this picture. The bird drawn in solid line is the body, or the real physical bird. The bird drawn in dotted line is the mental bird. In this picture, there is a two-way arrow indicating an interactive relationship between the mind and the body. Second, epiphenomenalism, which claims that the brain causes mental events. The brain also causes behaviors, but mental events are not related to behaviors. Mental events are byproducts of brain activities. This is illustrated by the one-way arrow between the real physical bird and the mental bird. Third, psychophysical parallelism, which claims that environmental events trigger mental events and bodily responses simultaneously, but they are unrelated. This is illustrated by no arrow between the mental and the real birds. Next, we put all concepts on one graph. Ask yourself, do you think that reality exists in one or two places? If one, then you are a monist. Then you further ask, does reality exist as mental constructs or as physical matters? If you think reality exists in the mind, then you are an idealist. If you think that reality exists as matters, then you are a materialist. If you think reality exists as more than one form, then you are a dualist. Depending on how you think the mind and the body are related, you can be an interactionist, an epiphenomenalist, or a parallelist. We say that cognitive psychology studies the processes through which an individual knows about the world, including objects in the world, other people around them, and the very own self. This is an epistemology question. Regarding this how question, you might have heard of the term empiricism and rationalism. An empiricist thinks that we know the world through sensory experiences, which are received by and stored in the mind. The mind is passive. It represents sensory experiences as mental images, recollections, and associations. A rationalist believes that knowledge can be obtained through reasoning. The mind is active and preoccupied with some pre-existing knowledge to actively transform sensory experiences. In cognitive psychology, there is another pair of contrasting approaches. On the one hand, some cognitive psychologists think that we know the world via representation. On the other hand, some believe that we know the world in somewhat a direct fashion without forming representations. We begin with the representational approach, which suggests that we know the world because our minds represent the world. Just as illustrated in the cartoon, there is a real cat in the real world, but a person first forms a mental representation of the real cat, and later on, all his cognitive activities are revolved around his mental cat. To representationalists, cognition is about to construct, manipulate, and use the mental representations of the world. Hence, the important assumption is the mental models should resemble the world objects. But how are representations formed? Some believe that representations are formed via computation. The human mind, like computers, are symbol systems. They manipulate symbols that represent the world. For example, the symbols of 2 or 1, 0 both represent the quantity of diamond-shaped objects in the world. Thinking is based on symbolic representation. The brain receives input signals, computes and constructs them by taking in feedback signals, and finally sends out signals that control the behaviors. Therefore, the processing is generally serial and entails a causal chain of events like dominoes. Hence, for people holding this view, their research objective is to discover the representational and computational capacities and processes of the mind. When studying behaviors, the mental processing is often broken into stages and investigated stage by stage. Let's use visual perception as an example. From a computational point of view, objects in the world project to the retina to form proximal stimuli, with which the mind begins to construct a mental model. In this view, the perceptual process begins with the proximal stimuli. Retinal signals enter the brain, and the mind processes the neural signals to put together a mental model or a percept, based on which one understands world and sends a command to execute actions. The process is a stimulus-response chain. Developed from the computational theory, a modern version of it is the connectivist model, which allows parallel processing of many stimulus-response chains or even forming a network. Leveraging on the advancement of computational tools, the network model is very popular today and can simulate many human activities such as neural activities, language and concepts, and social relationships. To summarize, when you think of epistemology, you ask yourself, does one know the world by representing it in the mind and understanding the mental model? If yes, then you are a representationalist. Be it the classical computationalism, connectivism, or other forms of representationalism, a representationalist assumes that cognition is directed to mental models, and a central issue is the correspondence problem, which means how to ensure the verity of mental representations, or the equivalence between the representation and the represented. The anti-representationalist view claims that the mind is not a mirror. There is no mental model space on which we process. In fact, there is a famous saying that the world is its own best model. Proponents of this view advocate that cognition is not based on similarity. There is no causal chain, no processing of parts before the whole, and the brain is no more important than the body or the environment in cognition. The three anti-representationalism approaches that we shall mention here are behaviorism, ecological psychology, and embodied cognitive science. Behaviorism is of great historical importance in the development of modern psychology. American psychologist John Watson introduced Pavlov's finding of conditioning to the West and promoted studying observable behaviors without resource to mental constructs. Behaviorism is the first prominent perspective that explicitly rejects mental representations. Behaviorists believe that men and animals are behaviorally alike, so they used a lot of animal behavior studies to approximate human behaviors. For example, B.F. Skinner's famous research work done with pigeons and rats. Behaviorism was taken over by cognitivism in the 1970s. The contemporary anti-representational approaches are ecological psychology and embodied cognition. This does not mean that these approaches grew out from behaviorism. The founder of ecological psychology is James J. Gibson. His original field of study is perception. The central tenets are perception is direct. There is no computation, no representation, not sensation-mediated. The brain does not assume a central or superior role. Perception is for action, and action is for perception. Therefore, the ecological approach is also known as the perception-action approach. Perception involves the perceiver and the world. They form one inseparable unit. The study of perception ought to consider perception-action unity and actor-environment mutuality. We shall discuss these ideas later when we study visual perception. Worth mentioning, although Gibson's original field of study is perception, ecological theories have been extended and applied to explain other cognitive functions such as memory, semantics, speech production, and industrial design. Inspired by the Gibsonian ideas, the embodied cognitive science approach is popular, and it explains and simulates human cognition. An important and early proponent of embodied cognitive science is Andy Clark, who suggested that cognition is not within skin boundary. Embodied cognitive scientists treat human cognition and behaviors as holistic and dynamical units that unfold over time. Treating human cognition and behavior as spatial-temporal is very important, reflected in research design. These researchers typically do not restrict viewing or response time in their experiments. This is very different from traditional cognitive experiments where participants view flashing stimulus and have to respond as quickly as possible, which includes a set of differential equations to describe the spatial-temporal changes of state variables under influences of some parameters. To complete the epistemology chart, on the anti-representational side, there are behaviorism, ecological psychology, and embodied cognitive science. In today's cognitive psychology, although there are conflictions, the common beliefs are that mental processes exist, mental processes can be studied, and should be studied empirically. Behaviors can be studied as a whole. Both functions and structures are important. There are four main paradigms to study cognition today. A paradigm is a body of knowledge structured according to what its proponents consider important and what they do not. They are the intellectual frameworks that guide investigators in studying and understanding phenomena. The information processing approach dominated cognitive psychology in the 1960s and 1970s and remains influential today. Researchers following an information processing approach often assume that information is processed, that is, it's received, stored, recoded, transformed, retrieved, and transmitted in stages, and that is stored in specific places while being processed. One goal within this framework, then, is to determine what these stages and storage places are and how they work. Connectionism is a newer paradigm as compared to information processing. It was developed in the 1980s. Connectionist models assume that cognitive processes occur in parallel, forming a network among many simple processing units. Evolutionary psychologists believe we understand a system best if we understand the evolutionary pressures, and humans have specialized areas of competence produced by our evolutionary heritage. Ecological psychologists emphasize on the actor-environment mutuality, that is, our activities change the environment, and the environment shapes the way we act. The smallest unit for studying human cognition and behavior ought to include the brain, the body, and the environment. We can see the influences of both the functionalist and the Gestalt schools on the ecological approach.